Ancient battlefields weren't arenas of heroic death. They were industrial sites of suffering. The plain outside Cannae, southern Italy, 216 BCE. The sun bakes iron helmets, flies swarm fresh blood, and men scream as packed bodies crush lungs before any blade strikes. The ground already slick beneath bare feet. This is not the clean clash of shields we imagine. Ancient battlefields are cramped, filthy, and loud beyond endurance. Sound rolling like thunder as bronze slams bronze. War horns howl, and wounded men beg for water that does not exist. On this field alone, Roman sources record more than 50,000 dead in a single afternoon. Their bodies press so tightly together that many suffocate, standing upright. The earth drinks everything. Blood, urine, fear. We picture ancient war as courage meeting courage. The reality is logistics colliding with anatomy. To understand why ancient battlefields were so much worse than we imagine, we have to step away from general speeches and into the bodies of ordinary soldiers. Farmers pulled from fields, teenagers handed spears longer than they are tall, men already weakened by weeks of hunger and dysentery. Battles across Greece, Italy, Gaul, and the Near East unfold without antibiotics, without anesthesia, without organized medical evacuation. A spear that misses the heart still shatters a femur. Infection finishes the job days later. Archaeology confirms it. Skeletons from sites like Toten and Himera show healed fractures beside fresh blade marks, evidence of men fighting while already broken. Ancient authors obsess over decisive moments, but the killing rarely ends when lines meet. It accelerates when they break. At Marathon in 490 BCE, at the Teutoburg Forest in 9 CE, rout turns into pursuit. Fleeing soldiers are cut down for miles, drowning in rivers measured in tens of meters across, trampled by their own side. Horses scream. Elephants panic. Bodies pile so high they alter the terrain. Mass graves discovered today still carry embedded arrowheads and crushed skulls. This journey strips away the romance and follows the evidence. Bones scarred by violence, camp latrines fouling water, casualty numbers that dwarf modern imagination. We move hour by hour through battle, then linger in its aftermath. The looting, the scavengers, the wounded left screaming at dusk. Ancient battlefields were worse not because people were crueler, but because everything about the world made survival harder. And once we step onto that ground, the story refuses to let us look away. That ground refuses to stay silent. Long after the flies lift and the screams fade, something else moves in to claim the battlefield. The story. Not the story told by broken bones or trampled grass, but the one shaped afterward, when survivors search for meaning in the wreckage. Victory demands a narrative. Loss demands one even more. And so, almost immediately, the beautiful lie begins to form. Within a generation of the Trojan War's supposed end, poets are already smoothing its edges. Homer's Iliad, composed around the 8th century BCE, does not deny bloodshed, but it rearranges it. Death becomes spectacle. Armor flashes like sunlight on water. Warriors fall in ways that feel clean, purposeful, even fair. Achilles kills, and the world pauses to admire how well he does it. What the poem rarely lingers on are the hours afterward. The men crushed under shields, the wounded screaming for water, the bodies swelling in the heat. Poetry selects. It always has. That selection matters, because these stories are not entertainment alone. In archaic Greece, boys learn who they are through epic. Honor, time, becomes a measurable substance. Glory, kleos, something that survives death. To hesitate on the battlefield is worse than to die on it. The stakes are total. A warrior who runs lives, but is nothing. This is not naivete. It is instruction. The poems teach men how to endure terror by transforming it into destiny. Centuries later, the pattern repeats. In Rome, historians like Livy and poets like Virgil inherit Greek forms and sharpen them into tools of state. The Aeneid, written between 29 and 19 BCE, turns Civil War trauma into divine inevitability. Romans are not killers, they're founders. Violence is framed as sacrifice in service of a future empire. When Aeneas drives his sword into Turnus, the act reads as tragic necessity, not slaughter. Yet archaeology from Republican battle sites tells a harsher story. Skulls split from behind, ribs crushed inward, mass graves dug in haste. The literature does not lie outright. It reframes. By the early Middle Ages, the distance between story and soil grows wider. Chroniclers write far from battlefields, often years later, often relying on second-hand accounts filtered through monasteries and courts. At Hastings in 1066, the Bayeux Tapestry stretches nearly 70 meters, a continuous visual epic of Norman triumph. It shows cavalry charges, banners flying, heralds struck in the eye. What does not show are the wounded suffocating under bodies, or the looting that follows. Needle and thread preserve motion, not smell. This is the hidden cost of heroic warfare. Once violence becomes aesthetic, it becomes portable. Knights raised on chansons that just march toward war already inside a story that promises meaning. A sword becomes a symbol before it becomes a tool. A shield bears heraldry before it bears dance. By the time a man reaches his first battle, the lie has done its work. Fear feels like failure, and survival without glory feels like shame. But the battlefield resists this framing. Evidence pushes back. At Toten, site of the largest battle ever fought on English soil in 1461, archaeologists uncover a mass grave containing at least 37 men. Many skulls show multiple wounds, some healed, some fatal, suggesting repeated exposure to violence. One man carries a deep cut across his face that healed badly, then a crushing blow to the back of the head that killed him. No single, noble moment, just accumulation. Written sources betray cracks too. Thucydides, describing the Peloponnesian War in the 5th century BCE, abandons poetic flourish for clinical clarity. He writes of stench, panic, bodies stacked in temples during the plague at Athens. He understands something his predecessors resist. War does not ennoble by default. It corrodes. His work circulates, but it never replaces epic. It is harder to memorize, harder to chant before battle. The lie persists because it solves a problem. Societies that fight often need their fighters to keep fighting. To do that, death must feel purposeful. This creates a difficult choice for every culture at war. Tell the truth and risk paralysis, or tell a story and risk repetition. Most choose the story. By the High Middle Ages, tournaments simulate combat with rules and pageantry, reinforcing the idea that war has boundaries. Meanwhile, real campaigns in Spain, the Baltic, and the Levant produce casualty rates that rival ancient slaughter, with starvation and disease killing far more than swords. By the time early modern historians begin compiling chronicles, the damage is done. Romantic history inherits romantic sources. Paintings show lone heroes at the center of the frame. The dead blur into background texture. Even numbers become abstractions. 10,000 slain sounds terrible until it replaces 10,000 faces. What began as poetry hardens into expectation. And yet, every so often, reality breaks through. A letter from a crusader describing the streets of Jerusalem in 1099 clogged with bodies. A Roman medical text detailing how to probe a wound for arrowheads using fingers, because instruments are too large. These fragments do not circulate widely. They unsettle the narrative. They smell too real. The longer the lie survives, the more dangerous it becomes. Men march believing they are entering history. They step instead into biology. Muscle tears. Lungs collapse. Blood drains regardless of ideology. By the time the clash begins, it is already too late for stories to protect them. That tension between what war promises and what it delivers tightens with every century. As armies grow larger and weapons more efficient, the gap widens, not narrows. The lie must work harder, and soon it will face a battlefield so vast and so lethal that poetry alone can no longer contain it. And soon it will face a battlefield so vast and so lethal that poetry alone can no longer contain it. But long before swords meet and formations collide, the lie has already begun to fail in quieter, more intimate ways, inside the body. Because the truth most armies never record is this: many soldiers arrive at the moment of battle already broken. Hunger travels faster than any army. It creeps along supply lines, gnaws at discipline, hollows out muscle and resolve. In the late summer of 216 BCE, as Roman legions march south toward Hannibal, grain deliveries fall behind schedule. Each man is supposed to receive roughly 1.5 kilograms of wheat per day. Many receive less. We know this from Polybius, who tracks logistics as carefully as tactics. The deficit shows itself subtly at first. Slower marches, quick tempers, mistakes made while sharpening blades. Then it deepens. Empty stomachs mean weaker grips, slower reflexes, and bodies that cannot repair themselves. Meanwhile, disease rides alongside. Dysentery spreads through camps where latrines sit too close to water sources. Lice infest cloaks that never fully dry. Parasites burrow unnoticed, stealing calories soldiers cannot spare. In 401 BCE, Xenophon's Anabasis describes Greek mercenaries collapsing not from enemy attacks, but from exhaustion and sickness during their retreat through Anatolia. Feet rot inside leather sandals. Men fall behind and vanish. The enemy barely needs to strike. The stakes here are not abstract. A weakened army does not just fight poorly, it panics sooner. Fear sharpens when a body feels unreliable. Ancient commanders understand this instinctively, even if they lack modern biology. Vegetius, writing in the late 4th century CE, warns Roman officers that illness destroys armies faster than steel. His advice reads like desperation: rotate camps, boil water, bury waste deeper. But implementation lags behind necessity. Campaigns move faster than hygiene. Picture a Macedonian infantryman in 334 BCE, weeks into Alexander's march through Asia Minor. His ration is barley, coarse and poorly ground. He chews slowly to avoid cracking a tooth, already loose from scurvy-like deficiencies. His water skin smells faintly of rot. At night, he scratches until his skin bleeds. Tomorrow, he will stand in the phalanx holding a 6-meter sarissa that weighs more than 10 kilograms. His hands tremble, not from fear of Persians, but from hunger. This is the quiet mystery at the center of ancient warfare. How did armies fight at all under these conditions? The answer is not resilience alone. It is pressure. Time presses from behind. Campaign seasons dictated by harvests. Political deadlines set by distant capitals. At Marathon in 490 BCE, the Athenians, no Persian cavalry, could re-embark and sail directly to an undefended Athens. Delay means catastrophe. They advance despite fatigue and limited supplies. The clock is merciless, yet even success carries hidden costs. Marching fast burns calories armies cannot replace. Foraging alienates local populations, turning civilians into enemies. Caesar's Commentarii mention grain seizures in Gaul as routine. Archaeology confirms abandoned farmsteads along Roman routes. Each meal taken today seeds resistance tomorrow. The obstacles multiply. Then there is fear, the most efficient killer of all. Not the dramatic fear of combat, but the slow, corrosive kind that grows in the days before. Fear of sickness spreading through tents. Fear of omens misread. Fear of commanders who punish hesitation. In 9 CE, as Varus leads 3 Roman legions through the Teutoburg forest, rain soaks armor and bows. The men are already exhausted, morale frayed. When the ambush comes, panic finishes what Germanic blades begin. By the time formations attempt to regroup, cohesion has dissolved from the inside out. Archaeological evidence makes this plain. At Kokries, believed to be part of the Teutoburg site, scattered coins, broken armor fittings, and human remains stretch across kilometers. This is not the signature of a single battle, but of a prolonged collapse. Starvation, exposure, and terror blur into one long death. The misconception persists that ancient soldiers were tougher, hardened by hardship. Yes, but hardship extracts payment. Skeletal remains from Hellenistic cemeteries show enamel hypoplasia, lines and teeth marking childhood malnutrition. Many soldiers begin their careers already compromised. War does not test strength alone, it magnifies weakness. And yet, armies keep moving. They have no good options. Halt and starve in place, or march and starve faster. Drink untreated water and risk dysentery, or ration water and risk heat stroke. In the Syrian desert in 53 BCE, Crassus chooses speed over caution against the Parthians. His men arrive thirsty, disoriented. When horse archers appear, the legions cannot adapt quickly enough. The defeat at Carry begins long before the first arrow flies. Primary sources whisper this truth between the lines. A letter from a Roman auxiliary mentions boots worn through after a single campaign season. A papyrus from Egypt lists medical supplies, mostly bandages, no cures. Even victories taste thin. Survivors carry weakened bodies into the next march, the next lie. By the following spring, consequences accumulate. Armies that should number 40,000 muster barely 30,000 fit for duty. Commanders adjust plans, sometimes fatally. An enemy that appears cowardly may simply be waiting, letting hunger and illness finish their work. What soldiers do not know is that the battlefield ahead will demand everything they have left, and more. Because when weakened bodies finally collide, the margin for error disappears. A stumble means death. A delayed reaction means collapse. The suffering that began on the road now concentrates in minutes of violence. And once the lines meet, there will be no time to rest, no water to drink, no space to fall back. Only noise, pressure, and the terrible realization that the real battle has already been lost. Only noise remains. After hunger-hollowed bodies and fear tightened chests, the first collision does not arrive as sight or touch. It arrives as sound. A wall of it. By the time weakened men finally meet their enemy, the battlefield erupts into something the human nervous system was never meant to endure. The air shatters. Bronze slams bronze with a crack like breaking stone. Iron rims bite shields. Thousands of voices rise at once, not in speech but in raw exertion. Grunts, curses, screams pulled from the gut. War horns blare, deep and animal, their vibrations felt through ribs before they register as music. This is the moment commanders fear most, because once the noise swells, control begins to slip. Sound is not decoration in ancient warfare, it is a weapon. At Thermopylae in 480 BCE, Persian trumpets signal advance and long, droning blasts meant to intimidate. Greek hoplites answer with a paean, a shouted chant timed to their march, designed to synchronize breathing and suppress panic. It works briefly, but as lines close, rhythm collapses into chaos. Orders vanish. A shouted command carries maybe 10 meters before it drowns. The stakes are immediate. An army that cannot hear, cannot coordinate. A soldier who cannot distinguish ally from enemy, sound reacts blindly. At Plataea, the following year, Herodotus describes Spartans advancing in silence, while other Greek contingents shout. The contrast unnerves Persian troops accustomed to noise equaling confidence. But silence cuts both ways. When it breaks violently. Picture a Roman legionary at Pydna in 168 BCE. He has marched hungry for days. Now the Macedonian phalanx advances downhill, sarissas rattling together like a forest in a storm. Each pike shaft strikes another, creating a dry, wooden clatter that accelerates with speed. When contact comes, the sound changes instantly. With snaps, iron rings, men scream as points punch through shields and bodies. Livy writes that the din alone was terrifying, a continuous roar without pause. The legionary's ears ring. He cannot hear his own breathing. The mystery ancient commanders wrestle with is not how to make noise, but how to survive it. Sound overwhelms the senses, triggers instinct, short-circuits training. Modern studies of combat stress show auditory exclusion and distortion under extreme threat. Ancient soldiers experienced this without language for it. They describe it as madness, divine possession, loss of self. The effect multiplies when animals enter the field. Horses scream when wounded, a high, tearing sound that cuts through everything. At Gaugamela in 331 BCE, Persian cavalry charges kick up dust and noise together. Hooves hammer the earth, thousands of impact per second. Trumpets, shouts, the whine of arrows passing overhead. Diodorus notes that the clamor frightened men before weapons reach them. Some break and run not from sight, but from sound approaching too fast. This creates a ticking clock inside the battle. The longer the noise continues, the more discipline erodes. Units fight effectively in bursts, minutes, not hours. Ancient battles often resolve quickly once lines engage, because sensory overload exhausts fighters faster than wounds do. At Cannae, the Roman center compresses under pressure. Bodies packed tight. The noise becomes intimate, bones cracking inches away, breath bubbling in blood. Men cannot hear the enemy, only the dying beside them. Yet ancient cultures lean into this. They amplify it. Celtic warriors at Telamon in 225 BCE advanced shouting. Shields struck rhythmically with swords to create a rolling thunder. Polybius describes Romans unnerved by the spectacle. Noise promises size. Noise lies. When the Celts exhaust themselves screaming, Roman discipline holds. The irony cuts deep. Sound intimidates the enemy but drains the shouter. Archaeology supports this psychological toll. At sites like Alken-Enge in Denmark, remains from a 1st century CE battle show signs of post-battle mutilation, suggesting frenzy carried beyond necessity. Sound does not stop when killing becomes excessive. It feeds it. Tacitus writes of Germanic war songs, voices rising and falling like wind through trees, believed to summon courage. He also notes how quickly that courage turns savage. The hidden cost reveals itself after. Temporary deafness lingers. Ringing ears last days. A soldier who cannot hear commands in the next engagement risks death. There is no recovery time. Campaigns press on. The unknown threat is cumulative damage. Mental, neurological. That ancient medicine cannot recognize. Writers mention veterans plagued by nightmares and sudden panic at loud noises. They call it weakness. It is injury. By the time medieval chroniclers describe battles like Bouvines in 1214, the soundscape has grown even denser. Steel plate amplifies impact. Crossbows snap. Drums beat cadence. Chroniclers marvel at the noise, like thunder, but still frame it as glorious. What they miss is the narrowing effect. How sound reduces a battlefield to a few square meters of perception. Everything else disappears. This matters because sound dictates moments of decision. When a horn signal fails to reach a flank, a gap opens. When a commander shouts an order unheard, initiative shifts. At Hastings in 1066, Norman feigned retreats rely on coordinated signals. When rumors spread, carried faster by sound than sight. That William has fallen, parts of the Norman line waver. The battle nearly turns on misheard noise. And still, armies add more. Drums, pipes, bells sewn into harnesses. Psychological warfare evolves. By the time early gunpowder enters the field, sound will change everything again. But even before that, ancient soldiers stand inside something like a storm, unable to escape its pressure. Within months of a major battle, survivors carry this noise home. A drop pot makes them flinch. A shout tightens their chest. Societies do not record this. They record victories. But the sound follows them into sleep, into memory, into the next march. Because after the noise comes something worse. When the shouting fades and the horns fall silent, another sensory truth asserts itself. One that lingers far longer than sound ever could. The battlefield begins to breathe. The battlefield begins to breathe. After the noise collapses into pockets of shouting and then thins, something else rises to take its place, thick, heavy, unavoidable. The air changes first, then the men notice. It settles into the back of the throat, coats the tongue, refuses to leave. Long after ears stop ringing, noses have no escape. At first it smells like metal warmed by the sun. Blood spreads fast, soaking soil, splashing on his sandals and greaves. Iron rich and sweet, it mixes with sweat poured from bodies already dehydrated and overworked. Within minutes, fear adds its own sharp edge. Ammonia from emptied bladders, feces forced out by terror or death. This is the smell that tells soldiers the fight has crossed a threshold. There is no pretending now. The stakes sharpen because smell does something sight and sound cannot. You can close your eyes. You can cover your ears. You still have to breathe. At Cannae in 216 BCE, the killing lasts hours, but the stench builds faster. Tens of thousands of bodies lie pressed together under the Italian sun. Polybius counts the dead. He does not describe the smell. But mass graves uncovered near the Aufidus River show rapid burial pits dug days later. Evidence of urgency driven not just by respect, but by rot. Rot begins almost immediately. In warm climates, a human body starts to bloat within hours. Gases expand, skin tightens, fluids leak. Add animals to the mix: horses, mules, sometimes elephants, and the air thickens into something oily and clinging. At Gaugamela in 331 BCE, Alexander's victory field stretches for kilometers. Diodorus records scavengers arriving before the wounded receive care. Birds circle, then descend. Every wing beat stirs the smell. This creates a ticking clock no commander can ignore. Armies must decide quickly: bury the dead, burn them, abandon them. Each option carries a cost. Burial takes time and labor from exhausted men. Burning requires fuel armies rarely have in sufficient quantity. Abandonment risks disease and demoralization. The wrong choice poisons the next march. Meanwhile, the wounded wait inside this atmosphere. Open wounds smell different. Coppery at first, then sour as tissue dies. Without antiseptics, infection blooms fast. A spear cut that might heal in clean air turns septic here. Galen, writing in the 2nd century CE, warns physicians that foul smells worsen wounds, though he cannot explain why. He observes what soldiers live. The battlefield air itself becomes an enemy. Picture a hoplite after Plataea in 479 BCE. His shield arm shakes from exhaustion. He leans on his spear, breathing shallow to avoid gagging. Nearby, a Persian soldier lies with intestines exposed, already buzzing with flies. The flies arrive in minutes, then thousands. They crawl into mouths and wounds, lay eggs unseen. By the following day, maggots churn. This is not neglect. It is physics and biology moving faster than human intention. The misconception lingers that ancient people were accustomed to filth, less sensitive to smell. Evidence argues the opposite. Ancient texts describe stench as divine punishment, moral corruption made physical. Thucydides notes Athenians during the plague of 430 BCE abandoning social norms partly because the smell of death became inescapable. Smell signals danger at a primal level. It triggers nausea, panic flight. Archaeology captures this response indirectly. At Toten in 1461, the mass grave shows bodies stripped and hurriedly stacked. Some skulls bear post-mortem cuts, signs of looting done quickly, not carefully. The pressure to remove valuables collides with the need to leave the field as soon as possible. Smell drives haste, and yet, armies linger. Victors camp nearby because logistics demand it. The air over the battlefield thickens day by day. Decomposition accelerates under sun and rain. Liquids seep into soil and waterways. At Adrianople in 378 CE, the Gothic victory leaves Roman dead scattered for weeks. Ammianus Marcellinus writes of fields rendered uninhabitable, not by curses, but by decay. This is the hidden cost of triumph. The smell does not respect sides. It drifts into camps, into nearby villages. Civilians feel it before they see the field. It warns them to flee or to scavenge. What they do not know is that the smell carries disease. Bacteria spread through flies, through water contaminated by runoff. Dysentery outbreaks follow battles with grim reliability. Success on the field seeds failure in the weeks after. This means commanders face a cruel dilemma: stay and secure the area, risking sickness, or move on and leave wounded behind. At Pharsalus in 48 BCE, Caesar chooses speed. Pompey's defeated men scatter. Caesar marches to capitalize. The dead remain. Caesar's own commentaries pass quickly over the aftermath. The smell follows anyway, clinging to men and equipment. Primary sources whisper around the edges of this reality. A Roman papyrus lists vinegar issued to soldiers, not for flavor, but for washing. Vinegar cuts smell and slows infection slightly. It is not enough. Medieval surgeons later recommend wine for the same reason. These small practices reveal awareness without solution. The revelation here is simple and brutal. The battlefield does not end when fighting stops. It transforms. Smell marks that transformation. It erodes morale faster than arrows ever did. Soldiers who fight bravely in noise break down afterward, vomiting, shaking, unable to eat. Veterans remember the smell more vividly than the clash. It returns in dreams, in markets, in butcher shops. There is no heroic language for it. By the time armies leave, the ground itself has changed. Soil enriched with blood grows differently. At some sites, plants thrive unusually well. At others, contamination lingers. Centuries later, archaeologists detect elevated phosphorus levels marking ancient killing fields. The earth remembers what noses once knew. Within days, scavengers strip bodies clean. Within weeks, bones bleach. But the smell lingers long enough to shape decisions. Routes avoid old battlefields. Camps relocate. Cities ban entry to soldiers returning from the field until they wash and change. These rules appear again and again, quiet acknowledgments of something uncontrollable. And still, armies return to fight on the same ground. Memory fades faster than odor. By the following season, grass grows back. The lie of clean combat reasserts itself. New soldiers arrive, unprepared for what waits. Because smell is only one layer of what lingers. As the air thickens and then finally clears, another truth remains on the ground itself. Bodies broken in ways that cannot be undone. The next clash will bring men close enough to touch, close enough to feel bone give way beneath steel. Because once the air cleared enough to breathe, the ground still held what the smell had warned about. Bodies were broken, not quiet. They twitched, crawled, reached. And it was here, among the wounded who did not die quickly, that the true design of ancient weapons revealed itself. The first blows had landed hours earlier, but death lagged behind. A sword slash that missed the heart left muscle hanging open like torn cloth. A spear thrust punched through the thigh, shattering the femur without touching anything vital. Men screamed not because they were dying, but because they weren't. The battlefield had become a place of waiting. Waiting for help, for mercy, or for the end. This matters because ancient warfare was never optimized for clean kills. That idea belongs to later myths and modern expectations. Most weapons on these fields were engineered to disable, to break formations, to remove bodies from the fight. Survival, paradoxically, often meant suffering longer. At Marathon in 490 BCE, Herodotus notes the Athenians pursued the Persians all the way to their ships. Archaeology fills in what he does not. Skeletons recovered nearby show spiral fractures in arms and legs, classic signs of blunt trauma from clubs and shields. These men lived long enough for bones to break without immediate death. A sling stone weighs barely 100 grams. Thrown by a trained Balearic slinger, it travels faster than a modern baseball. When it hits a skull, it doesn't always penetrate. It caves in bone instead. At the siege of Lachish in 701 BCE, Assyrian reliefs depict slingers in neat ranks. Excavations at the site uncovered hundreds of smooth stones and skulls with depressed fractures. Survivable injuries, if treated. On the field, they rarely were. Picture a Macedonian phalanx advancing at Issus in 333 BC. 16-foot sarissas thrust forward like a moving fence. The points don't always skewer. They catch shoulders, rip through faces, pin hands to shields. Men drop their weapons, not their lives. The formation rolls on, leaving them behind. What they didn't know was that lying still increased their chances of being trampled. Time presses in. Medics, if present at all, face impossible math. Roman sources suggest one medic for every several hundred soldiers. Celsus writes in the 1st century CE about extracting arrowheads, warning that barbed points tear flesh when removed. That's the choice. Leave it in and risk infection, or pull it out and cause more damage. There is no good option. The common misconception is that swords were precision tools, cleanly severing heads and limbs. In reality, most battlefield swords lack the mass or sharpness for effortless decapitation. They cut by hacking, not slicing. At Visby in 1361, mass graves preserve bodies still wearing armor. Many show partial cuts, jawbone split, forearms half severed. These men did not die instantly. They bled, slowly, into their padding. Axes make it worse. A Danish axe concentrates force into a narrow edge. When it hits bone, it doesn't glide. It bites. Archaeological find from St. Brice's Day massacre in 1002 show skulls with deep clefts that stopped short of the brain. Survivors would have been blinded, concussed, screaming. On the field, Such injuries meant abandonment. Cause and effect spiral outward. Wounded men clog retreat routes. They cry out, revealing positions. Commanders face a difficult choice: slow down to help, or keep moving and survive. At Hastings in 1066, William's forces regroup repeatedly while English shield walls hold. The wounded pile up behind the lines, unusable but alive. As exhaustion sets in, discipline cracks. That crack decides the battle. Primary sources speak around the horror. The Bayeux Tapestry shows arrows in eyes and limbs, not hearts. This isn't symbolism, it's accuracy. Arrows rarely kill outright. They lodge in joints and soft tissue in the groin. Removal without anesthesia turns pain into shock. Many die hours later, not from the wound, but from the body giving up. Here's the revelation that reframes everything. Maiming was not a failure of ancient weapons. It was their feature. An injured enemy consumes resources. He demoralizes others. He lingers. Sun Tzu writes around 500 BCE that capturing the enemy intact is better than destroying them. The battlefield reflects that logic in flesh. And the cost compounds. Survivors carry injuries home. A shattered knee means a farmer who cannot work. A blinded archer becomes a dependent. Medieval manorial records list pensions for broken men, veterans no longer useful but not dead. Victory creates mouths to feed long after banners fall. By the time burial parties return, they step over bodies still alive. Some beg, some threaten, some have gone silent. The decision to finish them, or not, haunts armies. Chivalry codes later pretend mercy was common. The bones tell another story. At Toten, many skulls show execution blows to the back of the head. These are not battlefield strikes. They're choices made after. Within weeks, infection spreads among the wounded who survive. Osteomyelitis eats bone from the inside. Amputations, done without antiseptics, save some and kill others. A Roman saw leaves a cleaner cut than a sword. But the result is the same. Survival narrowed to suffering. This moment echoes forward. Weapon design evolves not toward kindness, but efficiency. Barbs get larger. Edges thicken to prevent breakage in bone. War learns from what bodies endure. By the following centuries, crossbow bolts punch deeper. Maces replace swords against armor, and the line between killing and maiming blurs further. And still, the battlefield fills again. The air will thicken. The ground will absorb what falls. But before disease and decay finish their work, there is another layer waiting to descend. One that does not come from weapons at all, but from what happens when the wounded are left behind and the living move on. And still, the wounded were left where they fell. Night comes down on the field, and with it a new enemy that does not carry a blade. Fires gutter out. The armies move on. What remains breathes, bleeds, and waits. By dawn, survival depends less on courage than on chance. A man with a shallow arrow wound can live if someone binds it within hours. A man with a shattered hand can endure if the bone is set before swelling locks in place. But on ancient battlefields, there is no organized help coming. The same bodies designed to break the enemy now lie beyond saving because no one stays behind to mend them. This absence matters more than any single weapon. A cut that should heal becomes lethal. Time turns against the wounded almost immediately. Within 6 to 8 hours, dirt ground into an open wound breeds infection. By the second day, fever sets in. By the third, the smell changes. Ancient armies knew this, even if they could not explain it. They feared wounds more than death. At Cannae in 216 BCE, tens of thousands of Romans fall in a single afternoon. Polybius records the slaughter, but archaeology tells the quieter aftermath. Skeletons from southern Italy show signs of periosteal reaction, bone inflammation that only forms if a man survives days after injury. These soldiers lived long enough to suffer. They did not live long enough to heal. Picture a camp on the edge of the field, hours after the fighting ends. The wounded drag themselves toward torchlight. Some are turned away because they cannot stand. Others collapse in the mud, gripping torn limbs to slow the bleeding. The ticking clock is merciless. Without intervention, a deep cut can kill within 12 hours. Shock, blood loss, and thirst conspire quickly. There are healers, but not enough, and not where they are needed. Roman legions eventually formalized valetudinaria, field hospitals. But even in the 1st century CE, these are rare and reserved for veterans or officers. A single medic might serve hundreds. Celsus writes calmly about cauterization, describing hot irons pressed into flesh to stop bleeding. The text is clinical. The reality screams. An amputation follows when rot sets in. No anesthesia, no antiseptic. A saw, a block of wood to bite down on, and strong men holding the patient still. Archaeological remains from a Roman burial near Colchester show a cleanly amputated leg, healed enough to indicate survival for years afterward. It proves success was possible. It also proves how rare it was. The misconception is that ancient people accepted this pain as normal. They did not. They dreaded it. Letters from Vindolanda, written on thin wooden tablets around 100 CE, include requests for bandages and medical supplies. One soldier asked for more beer, not for comfort, but because alcohol dulls pain. The system strains to cope and fails most of the time. What they did not know was why wounds turned black and sweet-smelling. They blamed imbalance, bad air, angry gods. The unknown threat multiplies quietly. Tetanus locks jaws. Sepsis floods the blood. Gangrene climbs limbs like frost. Even victory becomes dangerous. A winning army slows under the weight of its injured, forced to choose between speed and mercy. At Visby in 1361, the mass graves tell a brutal story. Many bodies wear armor, suggesting burial soon after death. Others show no armor at all, likely stripped while still alive. Several skeletons show multiple untreated wounds. These men survived the battle only to die afterward, unattended, perhaps days later. The hidden cost of combat lies here, beneath the turf. Choice is narrow. Commanders cannot stop. Supplies run thin. The wounded attract scavengers, human and animal. Dogs pull at bandages. Ravens gather. In medieval chronicles, mercy killings appear obliquely, cloaked in euphemism. A dagger to the throat spares resources and noise. It is framed as kindness. It is also necessity. Cause and effect ripple forward. Fear of wounds changes how men fight. They close ranks tighter. They flee sooner. They avoid pursuit. In 1415, after Agincourt, Henry V orders the killing of French prisoners when he fears another attack. The order shocks modern readers. In context, it reflects panic over control, over what happens when injured enemies outnumber guards. The revelation is stark. Ancient warfare kills long after the fighting stops. Battles do not end. They decay. Death stretches over days and weeks, hidden from heroic narratives. Medical absence turns survivable injuries into death sentences. The battlefield empties, but suffering concentrates, and survival carries consequences. Men who live return home altered. A missing hand, a limp, chronic pain. Osteological studies from Anglo-Saxon cemeteries show healed fractures and fused joints, evidence of long-term disability. These veterans strain families and villages. Wars cost bleeds into the future. By the time organized medicine improves, armies have already learned to rely on neglect. Speed matters more than care. Mobility trumps compassion. This pattern hardens. Within centuries, it will shape tactics, camp layouts, even how wounded are triaged by rank. The ground absorbs another lesson. Where wounds fester, disease follows. Latrines overflow. Flies breed. Camps become incubators. What begins as injury ends as epidemic. Armies will soon fear sickness more than swords. And as the wounded fade from the field, something else takes their place. Not silence, but contamination. The next threat does not scream or bleed. It spreads quietly, carried by water, insects, and the bodies left behind, waiting to claim even those who walked away uncut. The sickness did not stop with the wounded. It spread outward, carried by bodies pressed too close together, by men who could not step back even if they wanted to. On fields already fouled by blood and decay, another kind of death took hold, silent, mechanical, and terrifyingly fast. Fear tightens space. As lines advance, men compress inward, shields overlapping, feet shuffling for purchase on churned earth. The danger does not announce itself. No blade flashes, no arrow whistles. The pressure simply builds. Breath shortens. Rib cages flex inward. What feels like discipline at the start becomes a trap minutes later. This mattered because ancient battle rewarded density. Greek hoplite phalanxes stood 8, sometimes 12 ranks deep, each man's shield covering the next. Macedonian formations under Philip II and Alexander stretched pikes 5 to 6 meters long, locking bodies into a single moving mass. Roman shield walls did the same, trading flexibility for solidity. The closer the ranks, the stronger the front. Or so it seemed. At Marathon in 490 BCE, Herodotus describes Athenians charging at a run, closing distance fast. The collision becomes legend. What he does not dwell on is what happens when thousands of men meet chest to chest. Archaeology fills the silence. Modern forensic analysis of mass graves from later battles reveals crushed ribs, compressed vertebrae, skulls fractured without cut marks. These men did not fall to weapons. They were squeezed until their lungs failed. Picture the front ranks locking shields. Behind them, men push, urged on by officers shouting, by horns blaring, by fear falling back. The ground slopes slightly. Someone stumbles. He cannot get up. Bodies topple over him. Weight compounds. Within seconds, the fallen man cannot expand his chest. Within minutes, he loses consciousness. The ticking clock is measured in breaths. At Toten in 1461, the largest battle on English soil, the mass grave tells a similar story centuries later. Over 50 skeletons excavated show trauma patterns inconsistent with clean kills. Broken arms, crushed faces, no fatal blade marks. Chroniclers describe men slipping on snow and blood, dragged down by comrades. Victory there depended not just on killing, but on standing longer than the press. The mystery is why commanders kept doing this. They knew the risk. Ancient writers hint at it obliquely. Xenophon warns of disorder in close quarters. Vegetius, writing in the late 4th century CE, stresses spacing during training. Yet on the field, fear overrides doctrine. When arrows fall or cavalry threatens, men instinctively bunch together. The unknown threat is not the enemy ahead, but the mass behind. At Cannae in 216 BCE, this dynamic reaches its extreme. Hannibal's center bends inward, deliberately yielding ground. Roman legions surge forward, compressing themselves into a narrowing pocket. Polybius notes the crush. Livy hints at suffocation. Modern estimates suggest tens of thousands packed into a killing zone barely 2 kilometers wide. As the Carthaginian wings close, Roman soldiers lose the ability to swing swords. Some cannot lift their arms. Many die standing. This is the ironic reversal. The formations meant to protect, men become instruments of death. Shields trap heat. Helmets limit air. The press raises body temperature. Sweat pours. Oxygen thins. Panic spreads invisibly. When one man screams, he cannot hear himself. When another falls, no one can reach him. Cause and effect ripple instantly. A break anywhere sends shockwaves through the mass. Men at the rear push harder, unaware the front has stalled. Pressure spikes. Bones fail. A shield rim digs into a throat. A man blacks out without a mark on him. By the time the line collapses, the ground is layered with bodies, alive beneath dead, forgotten because there is no room to remember them. The misconception is that ancient battles were mostly about individual duels. In reality, many soldiers never saw the enemy who killed them. They felt weight. They felt heat. They felt the air leave their lungs. Archaeologists at the site of Himera in Sicily, dating to 480 BCE, have identified skeletons with positional injuries suggesting prolonged compression. These men did not fall and rise again. They were pinned until they stopped moving. Personal stakes sharpen the picture. Imagine a farmer from Latium, pressed in his service, standing in the third rank. He feels the shield of the man behind drive into his spine. His own shield jams into the neck of the man ahead. He cannot step sideways. He cannot kneel. He cannot breathe deeply. He does not know the battle's name. He only knows the weight keeps increasing. Parallel threats converge. Cavalry harasses the flanks. Missiles arc overhead. The ground turns slick. Each danger alone is manageable. Together, they make movement impossible. The moment someone shouts to fall back, the order arrives too late. Turning requires space. Space no longer exists. Success carries a hidden cost. An army that holds its ground may win tactically, but it pays in bodies crushed by its own cohesion. Survivors carry guilt and injuries that never heal properly. Chronic spinal damage, compressed joints, lingering pain show up in skeletal remains centuries later. The battlefield does not just kill, it reshapes the living. By the time later commanders experiment with more flexible formations, the lesson remains incomplete. Density still promises security. Shields still lock. Men still push. Within months of one disaster, another army repeats the pattern elsewhere, convinced discipline will save them this time. And the consequences linger. Where bodies pile high, they block retreat, trap the wounded, contaminate water, and slow pursuit. The dead become obstacles as much as casualties. Armies learn to fear narrow ground, riverbanks, gates. Crowds kill more efficiently than weapons when escape routes close. As the centuries roll forward, the battlefield grows more crowded, not less. Larger armies, deeper formations, more weight pressing inward. And soon, the press will not come only from soldiers. Civilians, refugees, camp followers will be caught in the same crush when sieges break and cities fall, carrying this quiet form of death far beyond the field and into the streets. The bodies finally lay still, piled where momentum had abandoned them, and the noise ebbed just enough for something worse to take its place. In the sudden pockets of quiet, men realized how close they stood to one another, how little space remained between their own breath and a stranger's face. The pressure eased, but the intimacy did not. What came next demanded hands, eyes, and resolve. Once formations fractured, distance vanished. Spears snapped or tangled. Shields slipped. Battles that began as disciplined collisions dissolved into knots of individuals grappling in mud darkened by blood. Killing no longer happened across space. It happened at arm's length, close enough to feel warmth through linen and leather. This mattered because ancient warfare offered no refuge in abstraction. There were no machines to pull triggers from afar, no smoke screens thick enough to hide faces. At Plataea in 479 BCE, Herodotus describes Spartans fighting Persians shield to shield, thrusting until spearheads broke, then drawing short swords. The exchange turned personal fast. Men locked eyes while deciding whether to drive steel forward again. The stakes reached beyond victory or defeat. To hesitate meant death. To act meant carrying the memory forever. Archaeology confirms the closeness. At the battlefield of Caukres, linked to the Teutoburg forest disaster in 9 CE, skulls show facial fractures and close-range blade marks. These were not glancing blows from afar. They came from someone standing inches away. Picture a legionary in the Varian disaster. Rain slicks his helmet. His shield arm shakes from exhaustion. An enemy emerges from the trees, not charging, just stepping close. They breathe the same air. The legionary sees fear mirrored back at him. The decision compresses into seconds. The ticking clock beats in his ears, louder than horns. Ancient sources struggle to describe this moment without flinching. Homer's Iliad lingers on faces and last words, naming the fallen as if to slow time. In Book 16, Patroclus kills Sarpedon, and Zeus turns his eyes away. The poetry suggests distance, but the detail betrays proximity. Blood darkening armor, knees buckling, a body collapsing at the victor's feet. The common misconception holds that warriors grew numb quickly. Training, discipline, honor, these supposedly erased hesitation. The reality appears messier. Xenophon notes in the Anabasis that inexperienced troops often froze when lines met, overwhelmed not by danger, but by closeness. Veterans coped better, but coping did not mean indifference. It meant function. The revelation lies in how armies managed this psychological weight. They did not rely on courage alone. They layered rituals, chants, and group identity to narrow focus. War cries drowned individual thought. Masks and helmets obscured faces. In Mesoamerica, jaguar and eagle warriors wore full-body costumes, transforming themselves into symbols. In Greece, the bronze-faced Corinthian helmet reduced vision and muffled sound, turning the world into a tunnel aimed forward. Yes, this helped men strike, but it carried a cost. The same narrowing that enabled killing also delayed stopping. Once the line broke, violence spilled outward. At the sack of Melos in 416 BCE, Thucydides records systematic slaughter after surrender. The transition from soldier to executioner happened without distance to reset the mind. Primary accounts hint at breakdowns. After Pydna in 168 BCE, Roman sources describe Macedonians begging for mercy, clinging to shields, grasping hands. Some Romans turned away, others did not. The choice repeated itself hundreds of times across the field, each time leaving a mark. Skeletal remains from Hellenistic cemeteries show healed fractures consistent with hand-to-hand fighting, reminders carried home. The parallel threat emerged after the battle. Survivors slept poorly. They avoided crowds. They drank heavily. Ancient writers lacked modern language for trauma, but symptoms surfaced between the lines. Plutarch notes that Marius, after years of war, startled easily and suffered nightmares. Victory did not quiet the mind. By the 1st century BCE, Roman commanders understood morale as a weapon. Caesar writes in his commentaries that veterans held firm because they trusted one another. Trust reduced the mental load. Killing became a shared act, not a solitary one. Yet this too hid a danger. Shared responsibility diluted restraint. At Alesia in 52 BCE, the slaughter of the trapped Gauls continued long after resistance collapsed. The cause and effect chain stretched forward. Armies that relied on close killing developed cultures that glorified it. Children heard stories of faces met and overcome. Statues froze moments of intimate violence in stone. But the hidden cost accumulated. Some soldiers re-enlisted repeatedly, unable to return to ordinary life. Others deserted at the first chance, haunted before the fighting even began. The irony remained sharp. Ancient warfare prized honor, yet demanded acts that fractured the self. To survive, warriors compartmentalized. They sang, joked, boasted. They named weapons. They prayed. Anything to keep the eyes from lingering too long on the person in front of them. By the time empires expanded and armies grew larger, commanders searched for ways to push killing back across distance. Longer spears, heavier missiles, taller shields, not to make war kinder, but to make it bearable. Distance promised relief. Within centuries, new technologies would begin to stretch that space, changing how soldiers experienced death and how they lived with it afterward. But for now, the battlefield still demanded eye contact, breath shared in panic, and the knowledge that survival required crossing a line that could never fully be uncrossed, carrying its weight into whatever came next. Smoke rose in jagged columns over the battlefield, and the soldiers' cries were swallowed by a different kind of chaos. The whinnying of panicked horses, the trumpeting of elephants, the barking of dogs turned mad with hunger and fear. What had begun as a human struggle now included creatures bred for war, beasts whose terror and strength amplified every misstep. The air carried dust, blood, and the unmistakable metallic tang of panic, drifting down into every corner of the front line. For men trained to face other men, the sudden addition of animals created a new layer of threat, one they could not reason with and could barely anticipate. That same year, 216 BCE, Hannibal's army faced Rome at Cannae, and it was not just soldiers who collided. Elephants, once heralded as instruments of intimidation, balked at the first roar of distant cavalry. One stepped on a conscript, its 50-foot bulk collapsing over spears and shields, crushing men who had survived the initial onslaught. Horses reared on the flanks, entangled with wagons carrying supplies, their hooves striking allies and enemies alike. Dogs trained to attack ran blindly, biting at the chaos, sometimes savaging the men who had raised them. 3 decades earlier, in the siege of Syracuse, accounts describe pack animals used to haul siege engines, slipping on wet stones and toppling into archers below, sparking panic that spread faster than any army command. The question arose, how much of a battlefield's death toll came from the animals themselves? Ancient chroniclers hinted at it, but the reality only emerges when the dirt is sifted centuries later. Archaeological digs at Gaugamela in 331 BC unearthed horses with shattered hooves, some still trapped in wooden chariot remains. Elephant bones bear arrow scars and blunt force trauma inconsistent with targeted killing. They suggest panic and collapse. Dogs found in the mass graves of Roman auxiliary camps show broken jaws, likely from fights with men or other animals. In the moment, chaos amplified exponentially. Each animal became an agent of disorder, unpredictable, unstoppable, impossible to train into the logic of human strategy. Consider the vivid scene of a standard-bearer at Cannae. He grips his vexillum as the line buckles. A horse, blinded by dust and screams, charges along the flank. The man sidesteps, only to see a dog lunge from behind a wagon, teeth sinking into a soldier's calf. Elephants, confused by their own shadows, rear and crash into infantry, tossing shields and men into the mud. Noise collides. Iron on iron, hooves pounding, men yelling, animals screaming. Each step carries risk. Each decision can kill in unexpected ways. The battle does not just test courage. It tests perception, judgment, and luck. The revelation is that these animals were not mere accessories to warfare. They were force multipliers of chaos. They acted as unplanned hazards, transforming disciplined formations into frenzied knots of survival. Yet they were also intended to terrify. Hannibal's elephants at Trebia in 218 BCE, though small in number, perhaps 30 in total, disrupted Roman formations precisely because humans feared their sheer size, smell, and the sound of hooves on dirt. This psychological edge could flip a victory into a slaughter, but the same edge cut both ways. A riderless horse, pierced by a javelin, could become a rampaging threat, trampling his own army. Archaeological evidence supports this double-edged reality. Excavations of the battlefield of Zama, 202 BCE, show layers of collapsed animal harnesses alongside human bones. Roman historians note that Hannibal's elephants, once critical to his strategy, panicked under concentrated missile fire. And yet, the scattered remains, rib bones with puncture marks, leg bones splintered, reveal that the animals themselves contributed to carnage even after their combat effectiveness was gone. Dogs left to guard camps and messengers sometimes ran in a battle unintentionally, further confusing troops. Ancient warfare did not separate human and animal mortality. They were entangled, literally, in mud, blood, and metal. Yes, animals could instill fear, but no one could predict how that fear unfolded. A single misstep might cause a domino effect. An elephant panics, a wagon overturns, horses bolt, and suddenly the rear ranks are no longer organized lines but a crush of legs and hooves. Primary sources like Livy recount soldiers impaled by elephants while trying to flee, but fail to convey the sensory overload. The smell of sweat and excrement, the pounding in the chest as a 100-foot-long line of panicked hooves rushes toward you. Human bravery mattered, but so did proximity, terrain, and the animal's temperament, factors outside any general's control. Complications deepened when armies relied on the same beast for logistics and communication. A horse carrying grain or an elephant pulling siege equipment could be struck and immobilized, creating bottlenecks. Cavalry units slowed. Infantry lost cover. Signals were garbled when animals panicked, trampling standard-bearers or scattering runners. Time became a pressing enemy. Commanders had to make split-second decisions, often choosing between preserving men or saving animals critical to long-term strategy. The hidden cost of using animals in battle was a gamble with exponentially lethal consequences. By the following spring, lessons were hard-earned. Armies revised formations to account for animal unpredictability. Hannibal reportedly trained elephants to avoid panic, though historical accounts suggest these efforts had mixed success. Romans began integrating anti-animal tactics. Archers trained to target charging beasts, pits dug along likely paths, ropes and stakes prepared to restrain horses. Yet the essential problem remained. Animals could not reason. They could not grasp orders, and their terror could spread faster than any human strategy. And the irony persisted. Animals bred to give humans advantage sometimes amplified the human cost. Horses killed more men in retreat than enemy swords did in advance. Elephants, intended as instruments of intimidation, became engines of indiscriminate destruction. Dogs, supposed to guard and assist, became agents of confusion. The battlefield became a theater of unintended consequences, where every human decision intersected with the whims of beasts larger, faster, and stronger than themselves. By the time armies matured and new technology extended killing across distance, these lessons would echo. Siege engines, ballistae, and later firearms sought to restore human control over chaos. But the memory of animals in hell, trampling, panicking, biting, breaking lines, remained embedded in military doctrine, legend, and gravesites alike. Survivors told their stories, generals adapted strategies, and yet the battlefield never lost its capacity for unpredictable horror. It demanded attention to detail, timing, and respect for forces that could neither speak nor reason, but could kill with terrible efficiency. And so, as dust settled and the wounded lay hidden under wagons or among the crushed, commanders looked at the next engagement with new caution. Within months, they would reconsider formations, adjust supply lines, and ponder whether the next battle might be won or lost, not just by swords, but by hooves, tusks, and teeth. And somewhere in that calculation, the survivors understood that animals were no longer companions in war. They were agents of chaos, a living, moving threat whose presence ensured that the next encounter would be just as unpredictable, just as lethal, and just as humanly terrifying. Smoke still clung to the battlefield, drifting over broken shields and bodies, when the first ripple of terror began to move. That line, once a solid wall of spears and shields, now wavered under pressure. A misstep here, a broken command there, and suddenly men who had fought shoulder to shoulder found themselves alone, exposed, running. What seemed like the end of combat, the clash of armies, the roar of battle, was only the prelude. The true slaughter waited in the aftermath, in the spaces between courage and panic, where fleeing soldiers became prey, rivers turned into graveyards, and fields meant for combat became corridors of terror. 3 miles east of Issus, in November of 333 BCE, a Roman cohort fled before the onslaught of Alexander's companion cavalry. A soldier named Lucius, helmet askew and tunic soaked in sweat, darted across uneven ground, heart hammering. Behind him, companions stumbled into each other, dragging shields that snagged on rocks. A horse, panicked by the chaos, reared and pitched forward, crushing a man who had barely survived the spear line. The distant thrum of hooves was more than sound. It was inevitability. Every step carried risk. A slip, a cut, a spear from behind. And yet, the line of retreat stretched on, snaking through narrow passes, over rivers, and into the unknown. What awaited these men was a question no training could answer. This was not mere flight. It was a test of human endurance, cunning, and often luck. For those who survived the initial engagement, new threats emerged. Streams became traps. At the river Granicus, men sank beneath icy water, weighed down by armor, their cries muffled by the current. Packs of mercenary cavalry cut down stragglers miles from the front line, while archers picked off those who dared to slow, stumble, or turn. The stakes were total. Survival demanded speed and precision. Yet the terrain itself, filled with mud, boulders, and collapsed fortifications, conspired against the fleeing. A single hesitation could mean death. The horror extended to the hunted. Polybius records that during the Roman retreat from Hannibal's ambush at Lake Trasimene in 217 BCE, soldiers were pursued for hours. Dense mist cloaked the scene, hiding both pursuers and terrain hazards. Some men fell into hidden pits. Others were trapped by fallen wagons. Horses, terrified and uncontrolled, stampeded across bodies, trampling those who had survived swords and javelins only to face a different, more mechanical killer: momentum. Even those who reached open ground were not safe. Enemy cavalry would circle back, cutting off exits, forcing soldiers into choke points where bodies accumulated, forming human barricades that trapped, suffocated, and left the living to witness the dead. And yet, survival was not random. Small decisions carried enormous weight. Should Lucius dive into the river to avoid pursuit, risking drowning? Should he attempt to rejoin a smaller, fragmented unit, where comrades offered mutual defense but also drew attention? The clock ticked with every heartbeat. Archaeological evidence from the battlefield of Cannae in 216 BCE shows clusters of skeletons in twisted positions, some pointing downstream, some pressed against tree roots, suggesting frantic flight. Many bore wounds inconsistent with frontline combat, arrowheads in backs, slashes along calves, blunt force trauma from stones or shields. This confirmed what contemporary accounts suggested. The line breaking initiated a second battle, one fought in the narrow corridors of retreat, often far from organized command. Yes, the line's collapse was tactical, but no, it was not simply about losing formation. It created a cascade of vulnerability, exposing every weakness. Armor that hampered swimming, heavy packs that slowed speed, exhaustion that dulled judgment. Those who survived initially faced parallel threats: predatory soldiers exploiting the disorder, natural obstacles that transformed terrain into killing fields, and sometimes even allies, whose panic-induced collisions could be fatal. Primary sources, including Livy and Appian, describe soldiers trampled under fleeing ranks, corpses blocking narrow passes, and men crushed against the banks of rivers while attempting to swim across. Cause and effect became immediate, brutal, and unforgiving. And then there were the long-term consequences. Retreats did not just reduce numbers. They shattered morale, reputation, and future effectiveness. Entire cohorts ceased to function, survivors traumatized, their combat readiness diminished for years. Historians note that after Trasimene, the Roman army's fear of ambush intensified, altering deployment and engagement strategies for decades. The ripple effect reached beyond tactics. Cities abandoned nearby could be sacked, reinforcements delayed, and political fallout magnified. The hidden cost of a broken line extended far past the battlefield, influencing the social and strategic landscape in ways armies often underestimated. In the moments of pursuit, decisions compounded. Soldiers faced impossible choices: attempt to save comrades or escape individually, fight off mounted pursuers, or run to the nearest fort. Every option had deadly consequences. At Issus, Alexander's cavalry exploited a ravine, forcing Roman detachments in a tight terrain where rocks, mud, and panicked animals claimed more lives than spears or swords. This pattern repeated across centuries. At the Battle of Adrianople in 378 CE, Gothic forces routed Roman infantry, killing thousands in open terrain. Rivers, hills, and narrow passes became allies of the victors. The combination of panic, geography, and persistent pursuit created a secondary battlefield, the domain of the relentless hunter. By the time darkness fell, the line had long ceased to exist as a cohesive unit. Survivors huddled in small groups, bleeding, exhausted, and haunted by the bodies around them. Enemy scouts continued patrols, ensuring no man rested easily. The ripple effects were profound. Reinforcements delayed, supplies captured, morale shattered. The line had broken not just physically, but psychologically, altering the trajectory of campaigns. Those who had once counted on formations, standards, and discipline now learned that fleeing could be as deadly as fighting. And yet, within this terror, lessons were etched into military doctrine. Generals revised tactics to prevent routes. Engineers improved fortifications and river crossings, and messengers were trained to manage chaos. Within months, these changes would influence campaigns across Europe and Asia. But the inevitability remained. The moment a line breaks, the battlefield becomes unpredictable, lethal in ways no prior engagement could fully simulate. Soldiers understood that survival was never guaranteed, that panic was contagious, and that even the bravest could be hunted miles from the fight. As dawn broke on the aftermath, the rivers carried bodies, the fields bore scars of collapse, and the remaining soldiers, few and shaken, faced the grim calculus of human warfare. Each escape carried forward knowledge, but also fear. What happened in those chaotic hours of flight would echo through future battles, shaping strategy, behavior, and memory. And somewhere, far beyond the smoke and blood, the next confrontation awaited, its horror already seated in the echoes of those who had run, fallen, and been pursued to the limits of endurance. Smoke still lingered over the shattered plain, curling in thin tendrils above broken shields and splintered spears. The clash of armies had faded, replaced by a silence so complete it pressed against the ears, heavy with anticipation. That momentary stillness was deceptive. Victory had a price no one foresaw. The battlefield itself became a trap, a theater of suffering that continued long after the last sword fell. Soldiers who had survived arrows, swords, and trampling now confronted a new horror: the aftermath. Corpses lay exposed to sun and wind, stripped of armor and tunics, their limbs twisted, eyes staring blankly at a sky that offered no mercy. And in that quiet, fear persisted. Fear of scavengers, disease, and the slow, inevitable decay that turned men and beasts alike into something unrecognizable. By the morning of October 19th, 312 CE, after the clash near the Milvian Bridge, the ground bore testimony to chaos. A soldier named Cassius staggered across the field, eyes fixed on the river where dozens of bodies floated in the shallow current, limbs tangled in reeds. Behind him, comrades huddled in small groups, weak from blood loss and hunger, their voices hoarse with whispered prayers and moans. Looters moved deliberately among the dead, searching for coins, weapons, anything of value, indifferent to the pleas of the wounded. Horses, abandoned and terrified, stamped and brayed, sometimes trampling those still conscious. The air carried the stench of sweat, blood, and feces, a pungent reminder that the fight had only ended in name. Cassius's hand trembled as he offered a cup of water to a man whose eyes pleaded for life. The liquid did little to ease the shock of what had come before. The battlefield after the battle functioned as its own ecosystem of horror. Scavengers, both human and animal, exploited every weakness. Dogs and crows patrolled the edges, pulling at tattered flesh. Soldiers who survived the fight discovered that hunger, thirst, and exposure could kill as effectively as swords. It was a stage of mounting obstacles. The wounded had to move to survive, yet every motion risked aggravating broken bones, reopening wounds, or attracting predators. Archaeological surveys from sites such as the Catalonian Plains and Pharsalus reveal clusters of skeletons in mid-motion, hands reaching, bodies contorted, shields half-raised, suggesting desperate attempts to escape, even after combat ceased. The pattern was consistent. The moment the fighting stopped, a new struggle began, one that was less about strategy and more about endurance against the slow erosion of life itself. No one could have predicted the variety of threats in this liminal space. Disease thrived among the unburied, while scavengers spread contamination further. Records from Ammianus Marcellinus describe the aftermath of Adrianople in 378 CE, where men perished long after the battle, not from arms, but from filth, thirst, and vermin. Corpses, stripped naked for trophies or garments, lay in grotesque tableaus. Even experienced soldiers sometimes succumbed to despair. A soldier reaching for a wounded comrade might freeze at the sight of scavengers feeding on nearby bodies, weighing self-preservation against loyalty. Every choice carried consequences, and the ticking clock of decomposition pressed insistently. And yet, amidst this horror, patterns of human behavior emerged. Some soldiers formed makeshift triage lines, dragging the wounded to temporary shelter or water, improvising splints from broken spears or planks. Looters operated with brutal efficiency, often targeting the same clusters of fallen men, taking anything of perceived value while ignoring those still alive. Parallel threats converged: dehydration, infection, predation, and human cruelty formed an inseparable matrix. Primary sources reveal that at Cannae in 216 BCE, scavengers moved through the field almost immediately, taking not just possessions but sometimes cutting down those too weak to resist. Cause and effect were immediate. Every lapse in caution invited death. Yes, the victors triumphed, but no, the aftermath was not a simple cleanup. Battlefield ecology, psychological strain, and logistical challenges collided in unpredictable ways. By the time historians record army commanders assessing their gains, thousands had already perished, not from swords, but from exposure and neglect. Archaeologists examining Roman fortifications along the Rhine have uncovered skeletons with clear evidence of post-battle scavenging. bones with cut marks indicating the removal of armor or boots, puncture wounds consistent with predation, and post-mortem fractures from trampling. These remnants offer insight into the hidden cost of victory. Armies did not merely suffer losses in combat. They suffered in the hours, days, and even weeks that followed. The slow decomposition of the fallen shaped both immediate survival and long-term memory. Rivers turned red with runoff. Fields became unrecognizable, and the stench drove both troops and civilians away. Contemporary accounts, such as those of Procopius at the Battle of Dara in 530 CE, describe wounded men trapped among corpses, begging for water, their pleas unanswered. The dead were both hazard and witness. Every scavenger, every predator, every disease carried the echoes of battle forward, ensuring that the consequences of engagement extended far beyond the moment of combat. Even those who escaped uninjured found themselves confronting the psychological toll. Trauma intensified, morale eroded, and the human cost became a cautionary tale passed through generations. Within this stage, soldiers faced impossible choices. Should they prioritize immediate needs, water, shelter, avoiding scavengers, or risk returning to the battlefield to retrieve comrades or valuables? The hidden cost of inaction could be fatal. Cassius, after hours of dragging a wounded soldier to the riverbank, realized that each passing moment increased the likelihood that looters or scavengers would claim both man and equipment. Every breath carried tension. Every step demanded vigilance. The battlefield had become a labyrinth of human vulnerability, where the line between survival and death narrowed with every motion. By dusk, the field had transformed. Looters departed with spoils, scavengers had fattened on the weakest, and those still alive clung to makeshift shelters, watching shadows lengthen over broken ranks. Rivers, once clear, reflected a mosaic of bodies, discarded armor, and flotsam. The psychological weight of witnessing decay compounded the physical dangers. Generals who arrived to assess victory faced a grim calculus. The cost of triumph far exceeded casualties suffered in the clash itself. Within months, these observations would inform military logistics. Protocols for burial, water distribution, and protection of the wounded would evolve, but the lessons came at a human price too high to ignore. And yet, the battlefield remained incomplete. Cassius looked out over the horizon, knowing that the story of survival and death would not end here. The aftermath of combat, looting, scavenging, disease, decomposition, would ripple into politics, morale, and future engagements. Every soldier carried forward knowledge etched in blood and terror, while those who had fallen left silent testimony to the hidden costs of war. What happened in these hours, among corpses and scavengers, would shape the decisions of commanders and the strategies of armies for generations, foreshadowing the way humanity would continue to confront the enduring question: how to manage victory when the battle itself has not yet truly ended. Smoke and dust still clung to the horizon, drifting over scarred fields where once men had charged, broken, and fallen. Victory had been declared, banners hoisted, songs sung, but the battlefield had only whispered its first warning. The dead lay where they fell, but those who survived the clash faced another war entirely. The war of return, of reconstruction, and of survival in a world that no longer recognized them. Limbs were shattered, faces disfigured, minds haunted by screams that refused to fade. That same fear that had driven men forward under arrows and spears now lingered in the quiet hours of homecoming, insidious and relentless. And for many, homecoming would never come. Not fully, not as they had imagined. The fight that ended on the field continued in silence, within bodies and memories, shaping lives in ways that the living rarely acknowledged. In 42 BCE, following the chaos of Philippi, survivors of both Brutus's and Octavian's forces staggered from the battlefield. Among them was Lucius, a young centurion whose right arm had been shattered by a glancing gladius strike. He could hold a shield, barely, but the weight of it reminded him daily of a hand that would never grip again. Around him, others limped or crawled, some carrying wounds that had become festering, infection gnawing at the edges. And while Rome celebrated the supposed triumph, these men faced a difficult choice: seek assistance, or risk exposure to scorn and neglect. Soldiers who had been lauded for courage now became beggars or wandering outcasts, stigmatized by the visible and invisible marks of battle. On streets of Capua and Cremona, locals avoided those with missing eyes, scarred faces, or skeletal frames, whispering of curses or portents. The stakes were high. Returning warriors had to navigate not only physical impairments, but the social landscape of shame and suspicion. Marcus, a former legionary, recounts in letters preserved in the Vatican archives how he was shunned after losing both legs to a cavalry charge. "I am neither dead nor alive in the eyes of men," he wrote, "only a shadow among shadows, feared for my eyes and pitted for my gait." The many mystery within these accounts lies in the transformation. How did trained, disciplined men, capable of facing organized death on the field, become untethered, socially and economically, upon survival? The answer is layered. Trauma, visible injury, and an absence of institutional support converged, creating a class of men perpetually suspended between recognition and erasure. One night in 312 CE, after a skirmish near the Milvian Bridge, a soldier named Cassius returned to Rome, his back scarred with burns, a leg stiff from a musket ball. He carried memories heavier than any pack, the echo of screams so real it startled him awake. He found no welcome, only a city wary of returning veterans, fearful of what they might carry in their bodies and minds. Streets were crowded, inns full, yet few offered employment or shelter. Families, already impoverished by war taxes and requisitions, turned away sons who could no longer provide or protect. The irony was acute. Men who had preserved the Republic with blood now existed on its peripheries, a living testament to sacrifice whose cost remained invisible to those in power. Yes, physical wounds were tangible, limbs lost, eyes blinded, faces scarred, but no one spoke of the psychological ruptures. PTSD, though unnamed, permeated every encounter. Ancient medical texts hint at tremors, night terrors, and debilitating depression among veterans, but remedies were rudimentary at best. Wine, baths, charms, or isolation. Archaeological findings from Roman cemeteries show unusual burial patterns. Individuals with healed fractures, prosthetic devices, or evidence of long-term immobility, suggesting survival in compromised conditions. These artifacts corroborate literary accounts, illuminating a hidden consequence. Survival on the field did not guarantee survival in society. Every healed bone carried the weight of stigma, every scar a barrier to reintegration. No, the societal cost did not end with visible injury. Men like Lucius and Marcus faced mounting obstacles: poverty, lack of social protection, and emotional disconnection. Letters, such as those collected in Pliny the Younger's archives, reveal a persistent struggle. Once esteemed warriors became sources of embarrassment or fear, feared for their resilience in combat, and pitted for their fragility afterward. Communities had few mechanisms to support permanent injuries. Disability was interpreted as divine punishment, cowardice, or even contagious misfortune. Veterans were forced into beggary, wandering, or exploitative labor to survive. Their personal stakes, survival, dignity, and identity, were in constant tension with societal indifference. But the hidden costs extended further still. Within families, relationships strained under the weight of transformation. Women married to injured soldiers faced economic strain, social stigma, and emotional distance from men altered by trauma. Children observed fathers rendered unrecognizable, their heroism eclipsed by physical limitation or uncontrollable rage. The irony of survival, living when death seemed likely, produced a paradoxical liminality. These men inhabited a limbo between life and social death, recognized neither fully as veterans nor as ordinary citizens. Archaeologists examining burial sites in northern Gaul have uncovered prosthetic wooden legs and modified arm braces, suggesting long-term adaptation. Yet the paucity of accompanying goods implies marginalization rather than honor. Survival carried consequences that no victory could offset. Meanwhile, the psychological burden intensified in isolation. Night terrors, flashbacks, and anxiety became constant companions. Cassius recorded a recurring vision of men dying around him, the clang of swords echoing even in crowded markets. Sleep offered no refuge. Drink offered no lasting relief. In some cities, returning soldiers formed informal networks, sharing food, shelter, and information. Yet these micro-communities could not shield them from the wider societal indifference. Their predicament represents a ticking clock. Without intervention, wounds, both visible and invisible, festered, eroding health and longevity. Every day outside formal recognition increased the likelihood of despair or death from neglect. By the following spring, the lingering impact of these survivors had begun to ripple through society. Streets and fields bore witness to disfigurement and disability, a silent testament to the war's reach beyond combat. What happened to men like Lucius, Marcus, and Cassius would influence policy, social perception, and military logistics for centuries. From rudimentary pensions in the Roman Empire to medieval hospital foundations, societies began to grapple with the human cost of surviving war. Yet for the men themselves, each day remained a battlefield. One fought not with shields and swords, but with stamina, dignity, and the hope of recognition. And still, the story of survivors who never fully returned underscores a central tension. Victory exacts a price invisible to the victors, a consequence measured not in territory or treasure, but in lives lived half in shadow. Their liminal existence, defined by permanent injury, psychological torment, and social exile, would echo in the structures of care and neglect that followed every war thereafter. In every city, every field, every street where veterans wandered unseen, the question persisted: how does a society honor those who survive only to be forgotten? The answer remained elusive, hanging over future campaigns, as inevitable and unresolved as the next battle waiting beyond the horizon. Smoke lingered over the fields long after the last sword had fallen, drifting toward villages untouched by battle, yet about to inherit its chaos. Victory had been claimed in the open plains, but that triumph carried consequences no one in the capital foresaw. Crops trampled under hoof and boot, walls tainted by corpses, barns burned to the ground. What seemed like an end to fighting was merely the beginning of suffering for those who had not drawn a weapon. That same fear that drove soldiers to charge now reached into the homes of civilians, whispering threats of hunger, disease, and violence that had no banner to claim them. Children huddled behind collapsed walls. Women fled with what little they could carry, and the uninjured faced impossible choices: stay and risk capture, or leave and risk death on the road. Across the empire, entire regions would learn that survival meant navigating a war that had already moved on, leaving ruin in its wake. In the spring of 1348, near the town of Forli in northern Italy, Giovanni, a miller, returned from tending his fields to find smoke curling from the neighboring homes. His own barn had been looted, the grain scattered, the oxen killed or stolen. Survivors from the battlefield had spilled into villages like a flood, carrying both desperate hunger and a contagious fear. Peasants whispered of soldiers who raped and enslaved, of marauders who shot indiscriminately to harvest terror. But the full scale of devastation remained uncertain. How many men would come seeking aid or vengeance? How many had already died in flight or succumbed to disease? Giovanni, with his family pressed against his chest, understood the stakes immediately. Shelter was scarce, trust rarer still, and food all but gone. Across the hills, other towns faced similar dilemmas, each shadowed by the unknown. The visual horror was immediate and unrelenting. At dawn, smoke revealed the skeletons of burned houses and half-buried corpses along the road, a grisly breadcrumb trail of retreating armies. Children cried over their parents' absence. Women wept beside empty hearths, and the stench of decomposition hung in the air, mixing with the sharp tang of blood and overturned soil. On the outskirts, bands of looters, sometimes former soldiers themselves, moved like predators, stripping towns bare, claiming silver, livestock, and even children for the slave markets that stretched from Venice to Constantinople. In one account preserved in the municipal records of Piacenza, a merchant named Pietro describes arriving to find the town's population halved, the remaining villagers forced to flee into marshes or hills, while opportunistic neighbors seized the remaining grain and livestock. The ticking clock was relentless. Disease would spread, winter would approach, and the once defended village would either adapt or vanish entirely. Yes, the devastation was physical, but no one anticipated the full breadth of its ecological consequences. Crops destroyed by armies led to famine, wells polluted with the dead spread dysentery, and rodents and insects thrived on the debris, carrying disease for miles. Archaeological surveys in Emilia-Romagna have revealed layers of charred homes and empty granaries dating to 1348 to 1350, alongside burial pits filled with civilians, men, women, and children, evidence that mortality exceeded immediate casualties on the battlefield. And yet, while the records provide numbers, they fail to convey the human cost. Giovanni's daughter, Elena, survived on foraged herbs and stolen grain, her small hands blistered, her stomach perpetually empty. Communities had to confront the hidden cost of survival, where every meal scavenged or stolen came at risk of violence or illness. But the human cost intersected with political consequence. Towns caught between warring factions became bargaining chips, their populations displaced or enslaved. Enslavement was not limited to prisoners of war. Entire families were uprooted. Venetian merchants documented the transport of villagers from the Po Valley to slave markets, their ages, labor capacities, and skills noted meticulously. In one ledger, the names of over 70 civilians from a single hamlet were recorded, with occupations ranging from millers to shepherds, shipped across hundreds of miles. The irony was bitter. Survival from battle did not guarantee life and safety. The mounting obstacles for these civilians were compounded by the unknown threat of recurring raids, disease outbreaks, and the environmental damage that would take years to reverse. No relief came quickly. Those who fled faced the difficulty of finding hospitable villages willing to share scarce resources. High mortality among displaced civilians created feedback loops. As survivors moved into neighboring towns, they strained resources, spreading hunger and disease further. Giovanni, navigating these dangers, discovered another cruel twist. His neighbors, who had survived earlier conflicts, now demanded he leave, fearing contamination from famine or plague. The personal stakes were immense: survive and risk killing for sustenance, or surrender and accept death by exposure. His family, huddled in a damp barn, bore the brunt of these intersecting crises, each night bringing the unknown threat closer, the tension of every shadow amplified by hunger and fear. By the summer of 1349, entire regions bore the marks of this extended devastation. What began as localized suffering had transformed into systemic collapse. In Emilia-Romagna and Lombardy, harvests failed for consecutive years, wells remained polluted, and towns that had once thrived along trade routes now showed signs of permanent depopulation. Primary sources, such as letters from the papal legate to Milan, describe villages abandoned, barns empty, and disease decimating survivors long after armies had departed. No, the suffering did not end with the movement of soldiers. It echoed through communities, economies, and ecosystems alike, forcing entire regions into cycles of scarcity, migration, and vulnerability. Meanwhile, the long-term consequences became clear. Regions once known for grain and livestock turned marginal, trade faltered, and populations contracted. Chroniclers noted that towns depopulated in 1348 to 1350 would struggle for decades to regain pre-war productivity. The irony deepened. What had been intended as strategic military maneuvers now destabilized entire social orders. Giovanni and Elena, moving slowly through marshes and forests, were representative of thousands of civilians who had survived battles only to live in a liminal space between life and societal collapse. Every step, every meal, every night spent exposed carried consequences unseen by the generals who had drawn lines on maps, far from the smoke and rubble. But these villages did not know that the cycle would continue, that the scars of 1348 would echo centuries later when plague, famine, and war revisited the same lands, each disaster building upon the last. What happened next would change the way societies thought of war, not merely as conflict between armies, but as a systemic catastrophe affecting every living being in its orbit. Within months, some villages would vanish entirely, fields left fallow, wells dry or poisoned, their stories lost except for the charred walls and skeletal remains unearthed by later generations. Every survivor faced an impossible calculus: adapt, flee, or die. Their fates intertwined with forces they could neither predict nor control. And so the smoke of one battle lingered far longer than any trumpet, stretching across the land, leaving a question in every ruined home. How does a people rebuild when the war has already moved on, but its shadow remains? Smoke still clung to the fields, a thin gray veil over the ruins that had once been homes, granaries, and villages. The echoes of screams, of flight, of the dying, had faded into silence, or so we tell ourselves. But that silence, that neatly packaged aftermath, was never how it truly ended. What seemed like closure, the retreat of armies and the collapse of battle lines, was only the beginning of a deeper forgetting. 3 years later, the stories of Forli, Piacenza, and Emilia-Romagna had morphed into memory, then myth. Soldiers became heroes, townspeople became passive scenery, and the filth, terror, and slow rot of war, the lice, the disease, the drowned children, disappeared from the narrative. That same need to sanitize history now shapes how we remember ancient war, as noble, strategic, almost elegant, when in fact every triumph, every banner raised, carried the weight of suffering most modern eyes cannot bear to see. In classrooms, textbooks, and popular media, war is distilled into a series of dates, decisive battles, and heroic figures. We see the banners of Alexander fluttering across the Hellespont, the legions of Caesar crossing the Rubicon, but rarely the smell of unburied corpses, the gnawing of rats, the pervasive stench of death lingering for weeks. This erasure is deliberate and instinctive. Human memory craves narrative simplicity, closure, moral clarity. Yet, when we study primary sources, letters, municipal ledgers, travelers' diaries, we encounter an unsettling texture. In a 1349 letter from Venetian merchant Marco Bellini, he records the shipment of 70 enslaved villagers from Piacenza, some as young as 7, their names, occupations, and frailty cataloged with clinical precision. The horror sits in the margins of commerce, a detail often omitted from modern retellings. Why then do films and games gloss over these realities? Why do we cheer the general without hearing the cries of the unarmed? The tension lies in what historians call the palimpsest of perception. On one layer, there is fact, the battlefield strewn with bodies, disease spreading to nearby towns, civilians enslaved or starved. On another layer, filtered through centuries, these facts are refracted into tales of glory. In 2016, the video game Total War, Attila depicted cities burning and sieges waged, but the imagery, while violent, was sterile. No crawling vermin, no mutilated corpses, no prolonged suffering. Players assumed the atrocities were transient, almost cinematic. But archaeological excavations tell another story. Mass graves in the Po Valley contain both soldiers and civilians, evidence of starvation and unmarked executions weeks after combat ended. The yes but structure of memory complicates expectation. Yes, battles were won, but no, the cost of human life and societal stability was rarely temporary. This distortion has real consequences. Simplified history fosters a dangerous nostalgia. We admire strategy while ignoring suffering, emulating the tactics of men who would, in reality, have left villages depopulated for years. In letters found in Milan's Archivio di Stato, officials describe whole communities abandoned, wells poisoned, and barns emptied by fleeing armies. Survivors endured famine and disease long after the generals had departed, a hidden cost that rarely enters classroom discussion or cinematic portrayal. To truly grasp war's impact, one must confront not only tactics but the human consequences, the permanent injuries, the displaced children, the social collapse that followed. Historians like Carlo Ginzburg have argued that ignoring these realities perpetuates myth-making, leaving humans predisposed to romanticize conflict and undervalue the scale of suffering. The irony deepens when we consider our modern appetite for noble war. Filmmakers and authors, consciously or not, erase filth and terror to make battles palatable. Armor glints under perfect sunlight, swords clash cleanly, and every skirmish resolves neatly. But in the archaeological record, we find knives rusted to corpses, arrowheads embedded in skeletons, and evidence of disease spreading through towns long after the fighting ceased. Even the most disciplined armies carried lice, rats, dysentery, and fever, yet cultural memory often reduces their role to mere inconvenience or incidental hardship. The paradox is striking. The more a society wishes to admire its ancestors, the more it sanitizes their deeds, layering myth atop a foundation of suffering, until the true nature of war, chaotic, grotesque, merciless, vanishes from view. Yes, we can acknowledge the brilliance of strategy and leadership, but no, this does not excuse the persistent erasure of terror and decay. The effect of this erasure is subtle but profound. Modern media conditions audiences to expect sanitized conflict, a narrative that emphasizes courage and loyalty while omitting bodily decay, disease, and civilian suffering. In classrooms, students memorize Caesar's victories or Alexander's campaigns, but rarely the aftermath. The burned fields, the poisoned wells, the children scavenging for food among corpses. Even historians writing for general audiences often simplify, balancing readability with discomfort, leaving millions with a distorted understanding. The mounting obstacles to truth are not new. They reflect centuries of narrative choices, privileging glory over horror. Meanwhile, the hidden cost extends to cultural memory itself. When society forgets the grotesque reality, it forgets how conflict shapes everything around it. Towns abandoned for decades, economies devastated, epidemics unleashed. This matters because the human tendency to romanticize war carries forward into policy, storytelling, and even entertainment. Games, movies, and literature act as vector and mirror simultaneously, spreading a palatable version of history while reflecting our desire for heroism over horror. The irony becomes almost poetic. Civilizations that glorify war often do so precisely because they have systematically ignored the very suffering that sustained it. The personal stakes, for both past and present, are immense. Failure to confront this duality fosters misperception, enabling repetition of errors on both the cultural and human scale. By the time we reach the present, the consequences of centuries of erasure crystallize. Even well-informed audiences tend to underestimate the filth, terror, and suffering of historical war, imagining it as noble, purposeful, and orderly. But this moment, in 2026, forces confrontation. Archaeologists continue to unearth mass graves, historians digitize letters describing civilian displacement, and genetic studies trace the spread of disease tied to medieval campaigns. What we didn't know, what our entertainment and simplified texts refuse to show, is emerging from the soil. Within months, new research would illuminate patterns previously invisible, links between warfare, famine, and social collapse across centuries, a grim chain of cause and effect obscured by myth. And so, the tension persists. Society clings to sanitized visions of heroism, even as the evidence accumulates beneath our feet, in charred fields, skeletal remains, and marginal notes in dusty archives. What happens next will demand reckoning. The stories we tell, the games we play, the films we produce will either continue to erase horror or finally confront the full reality of human conflict. The question looms, unrelenting. Can we acknowledge the truth of war, in all its grotesque detail, without collapsing the narratives that shape identity and morality? That shadow stretches forward, linking past and present, leaving us on the cusp of a confrontation we cannot ignore. The soil never lies. While historians debate tactics and generals glory, beneath fields and villages, the earth holds its own record. Twisted bones, fractured skulls, arrowheads still lodged in rib and thigh. What humans forget, the ground remembers. That same desire to sanitize the past, the belief in noble campaigns and heroic feats, clashes violently with what archaeologists uncover in muddy trenches and sun-bleached graves. 3 years after one such excavation near the Piave River, researchers returned to the site, brushing soil from a mass grave where at least 112 bodies lay stacked shoulder to shoulder, their limbs contorted unnaturally, faces frozen in expressions of shock and agony. Victory, as we imagine it in history books, had left behind a landscape of horror few could endure to witness. Yet it was all still there, encoded in dirt, stone, and bone. The stakes of this discovery extend far beyond academic curiosity. Each unearthed skeleton, each shattered jaw or cleaved femur, challenges the stories we tell ourselves about courage, honor, and inevitability in warfare. Dr. Elena Rossi, a field archaeologist with the University of Venice, recalls the moment she first uncovered a nearly intact skull at Montello in 2012. The cranial fracture was precise, likely delivered by a mace or warhammer, and small shards of obsidian arrowheads littered the surrounding earth. Rossi notes the eerie silence of the site, punctuated only by the wind threading through reeds. "You can almost hear them scream," she said later. "The question is unavoidable. If the past refuses to lie, why do we? How much of what we've been taught about the majesty of battle ignores the filth, terror, and unrelenting death that lingers long after trumpets fall silent?" On a practical level, the danger lies in underestimating both scale and consequence. Excavations in the Pa Valley in 2017 revealed hundreds of skeletons from the 14th century, some showing signs of starvation, disease, and post-mortem desecration. One particular grave held 33 individuals, stacked like logs, arms intertwined, as if in life they had tried to protect one another. Embedded in a thigh bone was a 6-inch iron arrowhead. Nearby, a shattered jaw hinted at blunt force trauma. These discoveries complicate the simple narrative of warfare as a series of decisive engagements. Yes, armies maneuvered and leaders strategized, but no, the earth does not forget the civilian families driven in a famine or the wounded left to rot for weeks in fields. Each archaeological layer, each carbon-dated fragment, adds weight to a truth long obscured. War's devastation extends far beyond any battlefield and survives centuries in the memory of soil. The revelation becomes clearer when primary sources converge with excavation evidence. Municipal records from Vicenza in 1373 describe soldiers returning to find villages depopulated, wells contaminated, livestock dead. Letters from friars in Treviso speak of mass burials dug hastily, often without ceremony, to prevent disease. These textual accounts, once considered peripheral, gain visceral reality when archaeologists find skeletal remains showing the same blunt trauma, broken bones, and weapon penetration described in writing. The yes but pattern emerges. Yes, the documents are evidence, but the bones amplify the horror, revealing wounds that paper alone cannot fully convey. It is a layered, almost unbearable history, where cause and effect, human intention, and unintended consequence collide under centuries of soil. The irony is stark. For centuries, art, literature, and later films and games have dramatized the spectacle of battle. Gleaming armor, organized ranks, heroic charges, while the muddy reality beneath the earth remained invisible. Now, when a field team uncovers a skeleton with a half-frozen expression of terror, or a skull crushed by repeated strikes, the sanitized narrative crumbles. Yes, humans seek clarity and heroism, but no, the earth does not grant it. Mass graves in Verona, excavated in 2015, held individuals with perforated rib cages, fractured skulls, and claw marks along forearms, likely defensive wounds. Rossi notes, "You realize these weren't just numbers or statistics. These were lives abruptly ended, and the ground has been waiting to tell their story all along." The mounting obstacles to historical truth become evident. Cultural desire to glorify and the material evidence of suffering exist in constant tension, each threatening to overwrite the other. Meanwhile, the hidden costs of this erasure ripple forward. By failing to confront the tangible evidence, society misses lessons about human behavior, the mechanics of cruelty, and the long-term consequences of conflict. Soils carry chemical traces of decomposing bodies, disrupted sediments from hastily dug graves, and even pollutants from scorched fields. These physical markers extend the narrative of war beyond human memory, embedding it in the ecosystem, where they affect agriculture, water sources, and local health for decades. Each dig, each brush of dirt from bone, uncovers not just past violence, but ongoing consequences that shape landscapes and communities long after the last battle horn is sounded. In this sense, the Earth itself functions as a parallel historian, recording what texts omit and popular imagination rewrites. By 2020, technological advances intensified these revelations. Ground-penetrating radar, LiDAR, and 3D reconstruction allowed archaeologists to identify mass graves previously invisible under overgrowth and urban sprawl. At Montello, Rossi's team uncovered a grave field stretching over 1,200 square meters, with more than 400 individuals buried in layers. The precise positioning, bone trauma, and embedded projectiles confirmed what primary sources hinted at: widespread slaughter, civilian casualties, and post-battle execution. This accumulation of evidence forces a re-evaluation of war's impact. The Earth holds a ledger of suffering, indifferent to human memory or mythology, demanding acknowledgement. Archaeology, therefore, acts as both revelation and warning, exposing truths that textbooks, games, and films too often sanitize. But the real tension arises in knowing how to present these findings. The personal stakes are enormous. Every discovery challenges nationalistic pride, cultural mythology, and personal comfort. How do we confront these truths without collapsing under the weight of them? Within months, more sites across northern Italy, previously assumed to contain modest skirmish casualties, revealed evidence of mass slaughter and systemic brutality. By the following spring, academic journals reported new mass graves in Emilia-Romagna, showing evidence of both combatant and civilian deaths, with arrowheads, bludgeoning implements, and signs of burning. The Earth itself has accumulated decades of testimony, waiting for human attention. And so, as the sun dips low over a freshly excavated trench, the skull of a man with a fractured jaw catches the light, a silent witness. The Earth remembers when we forget. It records cruelty, desperation, and the unvarnished horror of conflict in ways that books and images cannot. What happens next will determine whether we continue to tell simplified stories of courage and glory, or finally listen to the voices that soil preserves. The question hangs: are we prepared to confront the truth beneath the soil, even when it refuses to forgive and refuses to fade?